It was a summer dawn in Salt Lake City, June 17, 2019. The streets were silent. Only the distant sound of cars and the gentle breeze broke the silence of the night. Mackenzie Lewick, a 23-year-old student at the University of Utah, had just gotten out of an Uber and was about to do something that would change her life forever. She had spent the last few weeks focusing on her studies, but the loneliness was starting to take a toll. With the free time she found between classes and work, Mackenzie started using dating apps, looking for a connection, someone she could talk to, and maybe more. Among the many conversations he had online, one in particular caught his attention. The man I was exchanging messages with seemed mysterious, but at the same time, intriguing. He suggested a discreet meeting, and Mackenzie, without thinking too much, accepted. That morning, Mackenzie didn't suspect anything could go wrong. She was independent, had control over her life, and considered herself capable of making her own decisions. But as she got out of her Uber in Hatch Park, a place she knew only by name, the feeling of vulnerability began to set in. The darkness was total, and the park's parking lot was practically empty, except for a car with its headlights on in the distance. She hesitated for a moment, but curiosity and a sense of adventure drove her forward. Her heart beat faster as she walked towards her car. "It'll be fun," she thought, trying to reassure herself. Mackenzie approached slowly, trying to see through the headlights that obscured her vision. When she finally reached the car, the passenger door opened, and a soft but firm voice invited her inside. She took one last look around before getting into the vehicle. The silence around her seemed to scream for her to stop, but the stranger's excitement was irresistible. When the door closed, the sound of the lock clicking echoed in his mind like a muffled alarm. The car began to move, slowly pulling out of the parking lot and onto the deserted streets of Salt Lake City. Inside the car, the man behind the wheel seemed calm, almost indifferent. He exchanged a few words with Mackenzie, but his tone was neutral, emotionless. She tried to start a conversation, but the answers she received were short and vague. The atmosphere inside the car was tense, and the silence between sentences was crushing. As he drove, Mackenzie looked out the window, watching the city lights get further and further away. She didn't know where they were going, but she didn't want to seem unsure or scared. However, an uncomfortable feeling began to grow in his chest. She tried to ignore it, convincing herself that she was being paranoid, that the encounter would just be an interesting experience to talk about later. Minutes later, the car entered a neighborhood Mackenzie didn't recognize. The houses were far apart, and the streets were dark and deserted. The man stopped the car in front of a modest but somewhat isolated house. "It's here," he said, getting out of the car without waiting for a response. Mackenzie, now completely uncomfortable, hesitated before following his lead and exiting the vehicle. As he opened the door to the house, Mackenzie felt a shiver run down her spine. Every instinct of hers was screaming at her to run, but reason and the fear of appearing rude or suspicious kept her moving forward. As soon as he entered the house, the door closed with a click, and the sound of the latch turning made his heart race. The inside of the house was dark and stuffy. The curtains were drawn, and the air felt heavy. The man gestured for her to follow him, and Mackenzie, her nerves on edge, followed him to the basement. When he turned on the light, what he saw left her speechless. In the background, a small room, with reinforced walls and a heavy door, caught his attention. She didn't know, but she was facing the beginning of a nightmare. At that moment, Mackenzie realized she had made a terrible mistake, but it was already too late to turn back. The feeling of imminent danger was overwhelming, but she didn't know how to react. The man, now with a look that seemed to reveal his true intentions, walked towards that reinforced room, making it clear that she was about to discover something terrible. And then, Mackenzie Lewick, the determined student who sought companionship in a digital world, disappeared from view of the real world, falling into the hands of a predator who would drag her to a cruel fate with no return. Salt Lake City, Utah, has always been a quiet city where people led ordinary lives, focused on their daily routines. But hidden in plain sight, in a seemingly ordinary neighborhood, one man was hatching a terrifying plan. Ayola Ajayi, a 31-year-old Nigerian, had moved to the United States in search of the American dream. But instead of following an honest path, he decided to delve into his dark and dangerous fantasies. Ajayi was known by those around him as a reserved but polite man. He was not the type of person who attracted attention, preferring to remain distant and off the radar of anyone who might suspect his intentions. He had a shady past, but not enough to arouse suspicion among his neighbors or co-workers. No one imagined that, behind the facade of an ordinary citizen, he was hatching a cruel plan. Ajayi had become obsessed with control and power. He spent hours browsing internet forums, consuming content that fed his twisted fantasies. His mind, increasingly dominated by dark thoughts, began to devise a plan to make these fantasies come true. He decided he would build a place where he could exert his absolute power over a victim, a space where no one would hear his screams for help. So Ajayi began transforming the basement of his house into a soundproof room. He meticulously researched how to make the place completely isolated, purchasing specific materials and spending hours working on the construction. He reinforced the walls with layers of soundproofing, installed heavy metal doors, and made sure no outside light could penetrate the space. Every detail was thought out to ensure that, once inside, no one would be able to escape, not even make a sound that could be heard outside. As he built the room, his thoughts revolved around how to fill that space with his macabre fantasies. He needed a victim, someone he could easily lure, someone who wouldn't arouse suspicion if he disappeared for a few days. It was then that he set his sights on online dating apps. He knew that many people, vulnerable and looking for connection, use these services. It was the perfect place to choose your prey. Ajayi created fake profiles on various dating platforms, using photos and information that appeared harmless but hid his true intentions. He began talking to several women, testing who might be most susceptible to his superficial charm and false promises. He knew he needed to be cautious. Every step had to be meticulously calculated so as not to arouse suspicion. It was during one of these interactions that he encountered Mackenzie Lewick. The young student seemed like the perfect target. New to town, looking for company, and most importantly, naive enough to believe that a casual encounter in a park might be safe. For Ajayi, Mackenzie represented the perfect opportunity to test his room, to see how far he could go without being discovered. He began to manipulate the conversation, appearing friendly, attentive, but at the same time mysterious. This combination was enough to pique Mackenzie's curiosity, who, unknowingly, was falling directly into his trap. Ajayi was in no hurry. He knew he needed to gain her trust before suggesting a meeting. Meanwhile, he continued to refine the details of his plan. He would soundproof the room repeatedly, making sure that no vibrations or noises would escape into the outside world. He adjusted the lighting, checked the ventilation, and most importantly, devised ways to make the place a nightmare for anyone who entered. Ajayi was determined to create an experience that he could control in every detail, where he would be the absolute master of his victim's fate. When he felt he had gained Mackenzie's trust, he finally suggested meeting. He chose Hatch Park as the meeting place, a park far enough away where he could pick her up without being noticed. Choosing the time, in the middle of the night, was also part of his plan. Fewer people on the streets, fewer witnesses. On the evening of June 17th, Ajayi was ready. He drove to the park, parked in a strategic spot, and waited. His heart beat faster, not from fear, but from the excitement of the control he was about to exert. When he saw Mackenzie getting out of the Uber and approaching his car, he knew everything was going according to plan. The brief encounter in Hatch Park was just the beginning. Ajayi led Mackenzie to his home, where the nightmare he had planned for so long was about to come true. He knew that once she walked through that basement door, there would be no turning back. For him, it was the culmination of his fantasy, but for Mackenzie, it would be the beginning of unimaginable horror. The door to the soundproof room closed, and with it, Mackenzie Lewick's last hope of escape. Ajayi had finally accomplished what he planned for so long. Now, he was in absolute control, with a victim on his hands and a space where no one could hear her, no matter how much she screamed. For Mackenzie, there was no way out, and Ajayi's macabre plan was just beginning. The days following Mackenzie Lewick's disappearance were marked by an eerie silence. His friends and family began to realize that something was terribly wrong. Mackenzie had always been a responsible young woman who maintained regular contact with those she loved. But now, no one could talk to her. His messages were not answered, and his social networks were inactive. The worry soon turned into panic. On the morning of June 20th, 2019, 3 days after Mackenzie disappeared, her absence was officially reported to Salt Lake City Police. The investigation was quickly launched, and authorities began to trace his last known steps. The starting point was Hatch Park, where Mackenzie had last been seen getting into a car that was not immediately identified. The first clue came from the Uber she had used that morning. The driver cooperated promptly, providing the police with all information about Mackenzie's final destination. The last place she was left was Hatch Park, but after that, the trail seemed to go cold. The investigation intensified, with detectives analyzing security camera footage, trying to identify the car she got into. Meanwhile, Mackenzie's family was desperate, making public appeals and using social media to try to find any clues as to her whereabouts. The media soon began covering the case, turning it into one of the most talked about in the city. The pressure on the authorities increased with each passing day, and the lack of answers made the atmosphere increasingly tense. It was while reviewing security footage from a gas station near Hatch Park that investigators finally made a significant breakthrough. In one of the recordings, Mackenzie was seen getting into a black car, a vehicle that, upon further investigation, was traced to Ayoola Ajayi. Authorities discovered that Ajayi had a strange background and reserved behavior, which raised immediate suspicions. With their focus now on Ajayi, police have begun monitoring his movements and investigating his residence. A search warrant was issued for Ajayi's home, and on June 26, 2019, a team of detectives arrived at the scene. The house seemed normal at first glance, but it was what was hidden in its basement that would terrify even the most experienced investigators. Upon entering the home, detectives noticed the strange atmosphere. Everything was in order, but there was something unsettling in the air. Ajayi, when questioned, tried to remain calm, but his defensive posture only increased suspicions. Investigators began searching the house, and that's when they found the door that led to the basement. The door was heavy, clearly reinforced, and when opened, it revealed a dark and suffocating environment. The soundproof room was exactly as Ajayi had planned. Thick walls, no windows, and completely isolated from any outside sound. Authorities found traces of equipment that suggested someone had been held there. The place exuded a feeling of despair and horror, as if the space itself held memories of the suffering it had witnessed. As they continued their search, investigators came across something even more disturbing. In the home's backyard, in an area that appeared to have been recently disturbed, they discovered burned human remains. The scene was macabre, and confirmation that it was Mackenzie Luick soon came through forensic tests. The discovery shocked not only investigators, but the entire Salt Lake City community. What began as a missing person case had turned into one of the most brutal crimes in the city's recent history. Ajayi's image as an ordinary citizen instantly crumbled, revealing the monster he truly was. With the discovery of Mackenzie's remains, police had enough evidence to arrest Ajayi. He was taken into custody, where, during interrogations, he showed little to no emotion. His facade of a polite, harmless man was gone, replaced by a disturbing coldness. Mackenzie Luick's story has become a tragic example of the dangerous realities of the modern world, where appearances can be deceiving and where the search for connection can lead to fatal encounters. For Mackenzie's friends and family, the discovery of her ultimate fate was devastating, but it also brought a sense of justice that, while it wouldn't bring Mackenzie back, would at least ensure her killer paid for his crimes. The city of Salt Lake City would never be the same, forever marked by the horror that Ayoola Ajayi inflicted. And as the trial approached, the community came together, determined to honor Mackenzie's memory and ensure her sacrifice was not in vain. Mackenzie Luick's case shook Salt Lake City, leaving a wound that would never fully heal. The community, still in shock from the brutality of the crime, was anxiously awaiting Ayoola Ajayi's trial. His name was in every headline, and the public wanted justice for the young student whose life had been cruelly taken. On October 1, 2019, Ayoola Ajayi's trial began at the Salt Lake County Courthouse. The courtroom was packed with journalists, Mackenzie's family, and members of the community eager to witness the outcome of this case. Outside, protests calling for justice were constant, with posters showing Mackenzie's smiling face, reminding everyone of the life so violently interrupted. Ajayi entered the courtroom in handcuffs, with an expression that seemed to defy any remorse. He was dressed in an orange prison uniform and remained impassive as he listened to the accusations. The prosecutor, determined to secure a conviction, began the case with a detailed narrative of the events that led to Mackenzie's death, reinforcing the coldness and premeditation of Ajayi's actions. The evidence presented by the prosecution was overwhelming. Prosecutors brought in forensic experts who confirmed that the remains found in Ajayi's backyard were those of Mackenzie Lewick. They described in detail how the young woman was lured to Ajayi's home, confined in the soundproof room he had built, and then murdered. Images of the room, with its reinforced walls and oppressive atmosphere, were shown to the jury, painting a vivid picture of the horror Mackenzie must have experienced. Message records between Ajayi and Mackenzie were presented as evidence, showing how he had manipulated the young girl, gaining her trust before leading her to her death. The prosecution also presented details of the purchase of materials used in the construction of the soundproof room and Ajayi's research into methods of concealing bodies. Each piece of the puzzle painted a picture of a meticulous, calculating predator. The defense, on the other hand, attempted to plead insanity, suggesting that Ajayi was not in full control of his mental faculties at the time of the crime. However, this strategy met with strong resistance, both from prosecutors and experts called to court, who argued that the construction of the room and the detailed planning of the crime indicated a cold and calculating mind, fully aware of its actions. During the trial, the court also heard emotional testimony from Mackenzie's family. They spoke about the unbearable pain of losing a daughter, sister, and friend in such a tragic way. Mackenzie's mother's words, in particular, brought tears to the eyes of many in the room. She described her daughter as a young woman full of life and dreams, who had a bright future ahead of her, until Ajayi destroyed it in such a cruel way. The trial stretched out over several weeks, but for many, Ajayi's guilt seemed undeniable from the start. The case presented one of the most disturbing accounts of premeditation and evil that Salt Lake City had ever witnessed. When it came time for the verdict, there was palpable tension in the courtroom. Everyone knew that the jury's decision would bring an end to this painful saga. Finally, on October 23, 2019, the jury returned with their verdict. Ayoola Ajayi was found guilty of all charges, including kidnapping, first-degree murder, and destruction of evidence. There was no doubt in the minds of the jurors that he had planned and carried out the crime in a cold and deliberate manner. The judge, in pronouncing the sentence, sentenced Ajayi to life in prison without the possibility of parole, ensuring that he would spend the rest of his days behind bars, far from the society he terrorized. The sentence brought some relief to Mackenzie's family and the Salt Lake City community. While nothing could bring Mackenzie back, there was a sense of justice being served, that the monster responsible for her death would never have the chance to hurt another person again. But at the same time, Mackenzie Lewick's case left an indelible mark. It served as a grim reminder of the hidden dangers in online interactions and the need to be vigilant in a world where evil can hide beneath the most innocent appearances. Salt Lake City, which was once seen as a safe and peaceful city, would never be the same again. The scars left by Ayoola Ajayi's brutal crime would remain for years to come, a constant reminder of the life that was tragically cut short and the devastating consequences of trust betrayed.